Okay. All right, there we go. Okay, so that's loud. Turn that down a little bit. Turn the lights down too. All righty. So, all right. A few really quick things. Obviously, midterm grades are up. So I got them done yesterday as promised. Sorry it took almost 2 weeks. Class average, since I know someone's going to ask, 79.6%. Right, so I can't remember. That's like 39.3 or something. I can't remember exactly what it is out of 50. But pretty standard, right? I think this is well within kind of my range of expectation for a 300 level class. So I'm not really concerned. Everything looked pretty good. You know, there was things ranging from really, really high, you know, in the high 40s, and a couple of people that got 50 out of 50 on the exam, you know, and then ranging into the kind of C range again, which I sort of expect. If you have concerns and you want to see your exam, I know some people have already emailed me. I finished it kind of late in the day yesterday, and then I did not have a chance to answer emails after that, and I sort of neglected email entirely so I could finish marking. So I was like, I'm just gonna not, like, honestly, if I go into my email, it's like sometimes 2 hours of my day disappear just answering emails. So days where I want to be productive, I'm just like, I'm not going to look at you. And I'm going to put my phone on do not disturb so that I don't see the email notifications, or I go in there and it's like someone asks me a question, not usually a student, but like faculty, and I'm like, okay, this is going to take some work to answer, and then hours of my day disappear. So my day today is, you know, I'm going to go answer some emails after this. Super fun, right? But yeah, if you've already sent me an email, I will get back to you either today or maybe tomorrow. Today's a bit of a crazy day, but I'll try to get back to you and we can make an appointment probably for next week for you to come in and see the exam. And we can kind of sit down and look at your exam and, you know, just see if there are any areas of improvement. I'm sure there's lots of good things too. So, you know, again, if you haven't done that yet, you can email me and we will get that going. Trying to think if there's anything else of particular import right at the moment. I think that's probably everything. Any questions? Anybody? Yeah, please. I have to look at the questions I have written for it. So, wait. Yes. Particularly on, I can give you a sort of heads up on it, especially for our next style of secularization, which is neo-secularization. There's sort of 3 big forms of it, and you might have to generate an example of one of those. That said, how much do I want to promise here? I will not guarantee that, because there's only 3 forms of it. You know, it's not like Smith's 10, you know, causal mechanisms. So there's less of them. So there's a chance that you might not get that question, but you could get a question on neo-secularization that would ask you to generate your own example of either macro, meso, or micro level secularization. It's less for certain than on the last one. But we'll talk, you know, we'll talk about those 3 forms of secularization in a sec, because we're almost there and we're getting close to finishing off secularization. I know we all want to live on theories of secularization forever, like I do. But we can't, because we're almost done explaining the big ones. Okay, so do I have a question tile somewhere here? It appears I am offline. That's helpful. I am not offline. Okay. I'm just trying to kick this in again. Okay, no questions. Duplicate slideshow. There we go. That's what I want. Okay, well, let's go back and we'll finish up talking about Stark's no secularization. And, or sorry, was there any other questions? I thought maybe you had a question. No. Okay, no, good. Let's keep going. All right, so we ended off last time kind of talking about Stark's whirlwind tour around the world that he's going to give us in his 2015 book, The Triumph of Faith. And again, much of this is to underscore his notion that what has sometimes been trumpeted as secularization and as clear evidence that the world is growing more secular, especially those places that are most, my pen half worked, those places that are most modern, right? Or where modernity has spread out the most. So the last one that we sort of tackled on Monday was his kind of look at Japan, right? Which is often taken as this prototypical secular country, specifically because, when you ask people on surveys like the World Values Survey, a lot of them will report that they have no religion, right? And again, what Stark is saying here is that the way Japanese people think of religion is considerably different than how Westerners think of religion, right? Because we think of, we would think of religion as belonging to a congregation, right? We typically think of religion in a churched way. For a lot of other cultures, though, you might have, a non, oh, my brain is slow today. You might not have to belong to only one, right? So when we talk about religious membership in Japan, right, statistics add up to more than 100%, and lots of them will practice lots of kind of different forms of religious belief, right, or spiritual practices, while maybe not saying that they are part of a particular religion. And again, if you think back to sort of my discourse at the beginning of the class, not this class, but the course rather, on Tom Holland's sort of invocation of this whole notion of secular versus religious as being a very kind of Western way of thinking about things, that you pick your religio, a notion that really comes to us from the Protestant Reformation, and especially from like the 1520s and 30s, that this is not necessarily something that's universally shared in cultures that didn't live through those particular cultural events or that cultural history. So in Japan, right, the majority of people will say they have no religion, but 90% of them, visit Shinto shrines, have Buddhist altars in their home, and have other sorts of spiritual or religious practices, which is odd. And this is where we ended off, right, with this notion from Stark that actually Japanese life is drenched in religious practices, and he cites just a couple, right? Going to a Shinto temple to have your car blessed, right? This guy right here, blessing somebody's Lexus, or when property is purchased, right? It includes a tax for a Shinto ceremony to purify the land spiritually. So, lots of different practices. Exclusive was the word I was thinking of. Boy, my brain. All right, so this is just some data out of the World Values Survey, just to kind of show, some of these practices that Stark thinks are kind of religious. So in Japan, right, and again, this is out of 2013, 2014, so not ages ago. Do you regularly visit a family grave at least several times a year? Yes. And why is that important? Because there is, in a lot of Asian cultures, sort of spiritual practices around ancestor worship and visiting of graves. And you can kind of see a weird, this example just came to my mind, and I know it's not perfect, but you can kind of see a weird echo of this in the Disney movie Mulan, right? Where they're invoking the spirit of the ancestors to bring forth the great guardian Mushu. Great movie, by the way. Love Mushu. One of the all-time classic cartoon sidekicks. But you see that in a lot of Asian cultures. Okay, after death, a person's spirit remains with the family, right? Over half of people disagree, and 16% are unsure. which at least suggests, right, that you think people have a spirit, which again, Stark would put as a sort of supernatural belief, right? It's not purely materialist in its in his way of understanding. Okay. Do you pray on certain occasions when you need assistance? Nearly 2/3. Oh, don't be like that. Nearly 2/3. Have you visited a temple to pray for a positive outcome in your life? 54%. Good luck charms, again, are almost 2/3. Do you feel that rivers and mountains have spirits, right? Again, like 60%, so that's a pretty strong thing, right? There's some belief in a sort of animist, sort of the earth itself has a sort of spirit, which again, not a I think, Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic kind of belief, but definitely a spiritual belief without any doubt. When a person is born and dies is predetermined, right? What would be predetermining it? That's, God or the fates or something, some other supernatural force, right? 75, almost 75, so almost 3/4 of people agree with that in Japan. And without reference to any established religion, do you believe that it's important to have spiritual beliefs? Again, we're talking nearly 3/4 of the population. So again, now none of this is to say that this is a deeply religious society or whatever. But what Stark is suggesting is that to call this society secular, where people have this sort of weird admixture of, lots of people have spiritual, albeit probably unchurched spiritual beliefs or unchurched supernaturalisms, to call this secular, he thinks is a bit of a stretch, right? Okay, so that's Japan. China. So China is a really interesting society. And, you could do an entire course, and I'm actually sure there is one in religious studies, on sort of the religious landscape in China and the religious history of China. So, China has a long history of a couple of things like Confucianism, which is a kind of spiritualized philosophical system that comes to them from Confucius. But of course, things like Taoism and Buddhism are also in the mix for Chinese kind of religion and spirituality. And a lot of things like Buddhism have this kind of weirdly been Sinoized, right? Transformed by their encounter with Chinese culture, so that like Chinese forms of Buddhism end up being quite different than, say, Japanese or Indian forms of Buddhism that you might find. Okay, so the other thing that's in the mix in China, I talked about this a little bit last class, is Christianity. And so, you can talk about, and Stark has a book, it's co-authored by, I can't remember who the co-author is. It was called Star of the East, about the growth of Christianity in China. So a couple of things that he says, and none of this, again, is I think, ironclad, and I think, potentially he might be overestimating the number of Christians in China by a little bit. But if we look back at, the 1950s, so prior to the takeover of China by Mao Zedong and the Communist Party, right? We think there were about 5-ish million Christians in China. So in a lot of ways, Christian expansion in China had not been tremendously successful, right? For such a populous country to have kind of 5 million Christians, mostly clustered around the coast where there were Protestant or Catholic missions, would not be, I think, any great success. And what people thought, and this was the term derisively used for, Christians in China, was they were what were called rice bowl Christians, right? That basically they were hanging around the missionaries because they were poor and because the missionaries handed out food, right? And so they're like, oh yeah, we're Christians, super, yeah, 100%, Jesus and all that stuff. Where's the food now? And so it was assumed, right, when China became communist and Christianity was officially banned by the Chinese Communist Party, that Christianity would essentially disappear because all the missionaries got booted out of the country. So there were no, they weren't offering any resources anymore. And, basically you wouldn't, if there's no resources, there'd be no Chinese Christians, right? So a lot of this would have been sort of based on a deprivation theory, right? They had turned to Christianity because of deprivation, but once Christianity no longer offered relief from that deprivation, they would be gone. Okay, now, today, after decades of, I would say, sort of control and sporadic persecution of Christians in China, it's hard to say, right? And again, religious research in China is extremely hard to do because the Communist Party does not want any Western polling firm doing research in China. The officially sanctioned Chinese pollsters are not reliable because they carry water for the Chinese Communist Party, right? So you cannot trust their numbers. They report the number of Christians at somewhere in the range of about 25 to 30 million. But we think for good reasons that the number is considerably higher. Also, if you're a Christian who's part of an underground church in China, and I can't remember what the name of the pollster in China is now, the official state one, and if they phone you up and are asking you questions, you're going to be like, no, nuh-uh, don't know what you're talking about, never heard of Christianity, I don't know what that is, right? Because you don't want to admit to a government agency that you're part of a religion that's at best tolerated. Okay, now, I think putting the number somewhere, I would put the number somewhere between 80 and probably 150 million. But it's really hard to say. I think that's probably a better estimate. At the high end, right, maybe 250 million, though again, I think that's way too high. Now, I think by most estimates, though it's really hard to measure, we think that Christianity is growing pretty robustly in Chinese society. And to explain why, you'd have to take a different course with me. I explained some of the theories behind it in I don't like to promote my other courses, but you can take it in the spring as an online course, CHRDC 203. Sociology of Christianity from St. Joe's College. But we think that it's growing pretty robustly in China. And, by some estimates, by 2030, sometime between 2030 and let's say 2040, we think there'll be somewhere around 200 to 350 million Christians in China, right? Now remember, Stark is writing this in 2014, right? So 2030 seemed a little bit further, or 2015. 2030 seemed a little bit further away. And again, it's really, really hard to know. The kind of current Chinese government is much more restrictive on Christianity than the prior one. So it's been much harder to get information. It's hard to know how well Christianity is doing. This, by the way, if we took 200 to 350 million, would essentially make China the country with the most, the single country with the most Christians on earth, right? It would pass essentially Brazil and the United States. So it would have more Christians in China than there are Christians in the United States or in Brazil, which are the two most populous Christian countries now. And one of the things that Stark suggests is that Christianity is rising not just amongst the rural class, where it is potentially seeing some success, but also amongst the young and college educated, right? Where it's often, Christianity has become linked with what made the West successful, right? That, and I don't know if I have it, I don't think I have it in here, but I have it in my other course, right? There's this quote where essentially, a Chinese intellectual saying, we understand, we've studied Western history, and we know that one of the secret ingredients that made the West so powerful and successful was Christianity, right? And of that, we have no doubt, right? So it's an interesting kind of quote. Okay, so that said too, religion in general, outside of just Christianity, has risen in China, and especially in moments where the government kind of backs off on general religious persecution, interesting kind of reviving a lot of traditional Chinese religions is there as well. So Buddhism, right, has become much more popular, and Buddhism has grown, and Buddhist practices, visits to, Buddhist shrines and Buddhist kind of holy sites in China has grown tremendously. The Chinese government at times has pushed, like I said, the quasi-religious philosophical system Confucianism, and things like Taoism have all, again, an indigenously kind of Chinese religion, have grown, and visits to Taoist, interest in Taoist philosophy and visit to Taoist temples has itself grown tremendously in China over the last few decades. Okay. It's Horizons. The polling firm is Horizons, right? So again, you can't entirely trust it. But Stark cites this 2007 Horizons study that suggests that 72% of those who said they had no religion venerated ancestral spirits by their graves. So Stark says, well, that's funny. That seems like a spiritual practice. Yeah, please.
I was just wondering, were the last numbers also including Hong Kong, or is Hong Kong over?
Hong Kong is a different story. This is more like mainland China. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, yeah, so again, Stark says this is a weird thing. You say you have no religion, but that seems like a spiritual or religious sort of activity. Okay, so when we look at our world values number and we count, essentially every person in China as part of the secular, well, that's an interesting one, right? 10% of those, again, these are those who say they have no religion, said they believe in God in heaven, sometimes referred to in Chinese as the Jade Emperor, right? Which is this kind of weird melding. When the Jesuits showed up in China, they sort of melded this the Jesuits are Catholic priests. They melded this concept of like the Western kind of Christian God with a kind of Chinese idea of the Jade Emperor. And so it's become sort of synonymous with kind of God in the way we would think of it. Again, these are those who say that they have no religion. 22% of them said they believe in Buddhism. Okay, so, and they make strong distinctions between church and unchurched religions, right? So they're not part of a churched religion, but we got lots of kind of what Stark would say is religious activity, even though it might be, unchurched supernaturalism in Chinese society. So again, is China really secular, right? Stark, I think, comes to the conclusion that no, China's not really secular. Because, for Stark, all of this really points to a society that is not secular in any way, right? It has a lot of supernatural beliefs. They're unconventional, they're unchurched, so they're hard to measure, and they're hard to measure by kind of traditional Western religious standards, but they are there nonetheless. Okay. Hinduism, right? So India. So again, India, kind of a big deal. Today, the most populous country on earth. And one of the things that Stark suggests here, again, all right, I'll give you some history. So when India gained independence from the British Empire, right, its first prime minister was Nehru. And Nehru, like a lot of the Indian elite, was British educated, right? So the elites and this is true to this day in a lot of cases, educated begins with an E, elites, right? And so they fundamentally believed in secularization. And what did they specifically believe? Modernity equals no religion. So coming out of the period of British controlled India, India was determined, and the early Indian leadership was determined to move along that same kind of process of modernization that the West had gone through, but specifically in some ways, India was looking at Japan as its model, right? Because Japan had industrialized and modernized really, really rapidly. And so Nehru, taking his good British education, even though he hated the British, basically wanted to industrialize, and he suggested that industrialization would erode the influence of religion, which he thought was a very good thing. Now, kind of weirdly, the opposite happened. So if we look at India today, 80% of India's population, of just a little over 1 billion, identify as Hindu, with strong Sikh and Muslim minorities in India as well. 2/3 of Indians, let me highlight this, because again, this is sort of Stark's point, have attended religious services. Oh, I selected an eraser. Things are going great. Have attended religious services in the past week. And 85%, right? Huge number. Super majority say religion is important in their daily lives, right? So these are, if we, and India, right, is modernizing. It wouldn't be, say, at the same level of modernity potentially as Europe. But, if modernity equals a decline in religion, then what we should see, according to Stark, is religion declining, right? And that's not what we're seeing in India. Okay, let's dig into some other stuff. So, Hinduism. We don't really know the origins of Hinduism. It's sort of lost in history, which is cool. It might go back as far, it's very ancient. It might go as far back as 1500 BC or BCE. There's lots of religious scriptures which I struggle to pronounce. The Vedas, the Upanishads, and the one that I always get wrong, the Bhagavad Gita. I cannot say that. I just cannot. Bhagavad Gita. I don't know. I've said it a million times and I can never say it properly. It just sticks in my throat. It's interesting. Now, one of the things that Stark suggests is that Hinduism is experiencing something of and again, here we're going to throw in some Christian terms, a revival, right? Hinduism is going through a revival. Industrial development has not led to the demise of Hinduism. And if anything, globalization, this is according to Mirananda, is making India more Hindu, right? And the symbols of Hinduism have grown tremendously. People's devotion to Hinduism has grown as well. So he cites this, in 1986, 3 million Indians visited the Vaishno Devi shrine. In 2000, that number was 5 million. By 2010, it was 10 million. Now, and we see this at shrines all across India. Now, I will say this. I don't want to throw shade at Stark because he is my spirit animal. Some of this may also have to do with India becoming more affluent, right? As people become more affluent, they have more ability to visit, to take time off, to travel, to visit religious shrines. That said, I don't think he's entirely wrong that, if modernization, equaled secularization, that probably, you would see, especially amongst the elites, these numbers kind of declining. Okay. So, national survey conducted in 2007, again, found that 33% of Indians reported becoming more religious in the past 5 years, and only 5% said they'd become less religious. So again, Stark is making the argument here that as India moves into modernity more and more, it's not becoming less religious, it's becoming more religious, right? It's actually increasing its religiosity. And there's a bad aspect to this too. we've seen a sharp rise in religious conflicts in India between Hindus and other minorities, right? Between Christians, Muslims, and Sikhs, all of whom have had increasing kind of conflict with the Hindu majority. And this has become, so when Stark wrote this book, this was not the case, but the current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is a Hindu nationalist and has anchored much of his sort of appeal on a really strong Hindu nationalism, which has increased this kind of tension with other religious groups in India. Okay, and there's all sorts of interesting stats out of India, right? As this kind of Hindu nationalism grows, people who say that they are, Hindu will say things like they are more uncomfortable with living next to someone who is of a different religion, right? So it's not all for the good. There's definitely some, xenophobia, potentially, anti-Sikh in particular, and anti-Muslim sentiment growing in parts of India. So it's not all for the good. Okay, and again, this is a sort of shot at deprivation theory, this little chart here. What we see is, right, and this is a broad contention that Stark will make in other places, that often, we tend to think that, because of deprivation theory, that the poor are the most likely to be religious. But this is actually often not the case. The most religious tend to be the wealthy and the middle class. We'll talk about this in the rise of Christianity, because it's an interesting point. But to break it down substantially, when you have time to not worry about your basic needs, you have time to start thinking religious thoughts. So what do we see here in terms of kind of this little chart? Percentage who pray, right? You can see basically it drops as people get poorer, and the percentage who say religion is very important to them also drops. So, consistent with Stark's kind of general ideology that actually, this kind of deprivation theory that Marx, I was going to say peddles, but that's wrong. Marx and Marxists posit, we'll say posit, that's a nicer word, is incorrect, because actually we're going to find more religion in the wealthy and middle classes than amongst the poor. Okay. I think this is the last slide. For Stark, and so this is taking data, for essentially 4 decades, 3 decades. And this is from the Baylor, a mix of the Baylor Religion Survey and the World Values Survey. But basically, percentage who attend church weekly in the United States. And the thing to kind of, notice here is that substantially weekly church attendance in the United States, according to these numbers, is basically flat, right? You have some kind of up and down, I think it kind of comes out at a high of 37 and a low of 29, but basically kind of stays in the range of somewhere between, 33 and 35% for the most part. So what he'll say is, again, America is super modern, right? It's probably, it's very modern, probably amongst the most modern states on earth, and yet religious service attendance essentially has remained the same, for decades in terms of weekly attendance. And this number gets bigger if you count, several times a month, as within that. So people go like twice or 3 times a month or once. So religion in America hasn't substantially declined. Okay, how are we doing? Are we ready to move on from Stark, no secularization? I don't know if he sold you, but I've given you as much as I can give you on Stark's no secularization. Okay, so we're going to move into our kind of not our last model. We have 2 other models after this, but they're short. Our last big model, which is sometimes called revised or sometimes called neo-secularization. I like to use neo because I think it sounds cooler. No, I find it's easier to not get sort of mixed up with the inherited model and Bruce's kind of revised inherited model, or late secularization, so I like to use neo-secularization. Okay, so with neo-secularization, this is something that, these are kind of things that I think almost everybody agrees on, and this would include, the thinkers we've talked about, guys like Christian Smith, and I think even Rodney Stark would agree with most of these points. Okay, so point number one. So, social changes associated with modernity impact religion. In Secularization, RIP, Stark says, yeah, duh. Of course that's true, right? As society changes, it's going to impact religion. He just doesn't think that means secularization. Okay, so again, I think Stark broadly agrees with this. Religious authority ceases to dominate all spheres of life. Again, as the state takes over things like the social welfare system, yes, religion is going to recede a little bit. But, and here's the question, is modernity synonymous with religious decline, or does religion just change in character as society changed in character? Okay, and I think one of the things that, say, people like Christian Smith, and we're going to talk about Mark Chavez, because neo-secularization is sort of based on his piece, secularization as a decline in religious authority. I think everybody sort of agrees on this, with the exception of Steve Bruce and a few people, that clearly modernity isn't necessarily toxic to religion, right? And here I'm going to stress this because I think it's important. Religions can thrive and expand in modernity given the right conditions. Now, potentially, as conditions change, right? As you bring in maybe new technologies, greater globalization, religions may struggle to adapt to certain changes in modernity. But clearly, in some forms of modernity, at some places and some times, religion has done just fine. So, we can't really say that modernity is toxic to religion anymore. But the scope of religion is probably different in modern societies than it was in the past. And I think, again, that's kind of inarguable. Okay. Parson and Bella, right? So we remember these cats. Talked about them in theories. Two kind of functionalists. What they would suggest is, as we move from the Middle Ages or pre-modernity into modernity, we experience a growth in social complexity, right? And again, Weber talked about this, Durkheim talked about this. Societies get more complex. The state starts to play a bigger role. Society to function requires more coordination, right? Especially from powerful bureaucracies. Religion for Parson and Bella, religion, as it's pushed out in some ways by institutional differentiation and the state taking over roles that it used to have, goes from a public matter more to a private matter. Now, Parson and Bella don't ultimately view this as a negative change, just something that's happening, right? So, this is I think an interesting one. I'm going to highlight all of this because I think it's fun. People increasingly in modernity choose their own beliefs instead of being indoctrinated, right? So, because we have a growth of individualism and individuality, a breakdown of kind of people being grounded in these really strong, really deep, really historical social groups, people increasingly have to choose for themselves what they believe. It's a lot of the heuristics that used to guide, how people became, or how people form their identities kind of break down in modernity. So people have to choose their own religious identities. Now, what Parson and Bella will suggest, however, is that this might not necessarily be bad for religion, because a religion that is chosen potentially is more important to the individual than a religion that was simply passed on to them. And if you've ever known anybody who went through like a religious conversion, right, who, I don't know, they grew up non-religious, they became Catholic, or they grew up Protestant and they converted to Catholicism, or, they chose a non-religious identity, right? In a lot of ways, those people are the firmest advocates for that particular religion that they've chosen, right? Because they've made a kind of positive choice. Okay, and in the West, right, Christian ideals are going to continue to have influence, and that is, something that, again, if you want to see someone else making that argument, Tom Holland's book, Dominion. I know I've talked about it like a million times. I just think it's an awesome book. Tom Holland, not Spider-Man. And you should really read this book. It's a great book. Okay, so, but yeah, we're going to continue to see, religious influence, even though organized Christianity is becoming less important. Okay, and Parsons and Bella, they would say, if we define secularism as a process by which religion decreases in importance and by which it has less influence on one's worldview and social behavior, then they didn't think it was happening, right? And again, Parsons and Bella are writing middle part of the 20th century, so you can take that for what it is. But they tend to think of, secularization as a sort of religious progression or evolution. So religion is progressing rather than dissolving, right? And they would be on board with something like Thomas Luckman's idea of invisible religion, that it becomes more personal, it becomes less institutionalized, and people in modernity sort of start cobbling together religious beliefs from the available kind of religious materials. Okay, no questions? All right. So, this is the last, this is theory number 3, right? So we had, this is number 4. So we had inherited model, late secularization or religion is alien, that's number 2. Number 3 is no secularization from Stark. So this is secularization theory number 4, right? Neo-secularization. All right, so this comes to us from Mark Chavez. I think he's at University of Notre Dame. And basically what he suggested is, what we see is a decline in religious authority, right? That secularization is not the end of religion. Religion seems to, remain in societies for a long time. We're not actually seeing the decline of kind of spiritual or religious beliefs, but what we do see as, secularization now is a decline in religious authority, right? There's less religious authority, but people broadly still believe in something. So what he says is, in the US, secularization is definitely taking place at what he calls the macro level, but it's far less clear at the micro level, right? And we'll talk about that in a sec. And this is driven, he suggests, by institutional differentiation. And there's our buddy Steve Bruce, back again for an encore presentation. Right, practices of the religious sphere. So again, institutional differentiation, the things religion used to do, run the schools, the hospitals, the social welfare system, that's all been taken over by the state for the most part. And so the religious sphere has only indirect effects on other spheres, right? So instead of being, religion used to be like this and everything else was inside it, now religion is just one part of the world amongst many, and it has only limited influence on the other spheres of social life, right? So religious institutions may have limited or no influence on other spheres. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. How am I doing for time? Oh, I'm doing awesome. Okay, so the first level, he says, is macro secularization. So we see a decline of religion in the social sphere. Again, this is your institutional differentiation. Religion, which was kind of intimately linked to other social institutions and often controlled them, has ceased to do so, right? So religion no longer generally runs the schools, right? Medical care is no longer under religious control, and social welfare, ceases to be the purview of religious organizations. And this happens in different ways in different places, but for the most part, in modern countries, this is all true. So they have become one institution amongst many. So here, I think again, I don't think even Stark would kind of argue this. Definitely, religion's place in society is different today than it was 70, 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, right? Its role on the institutional level is receding, and it's increasingly, one institution among many. I'm going to highlight that because, again, I think it's important. It's one institution among many rather than the dominant institution. right? Your whole life doesn't revolve around your affiliation with the church anymore. And you can go a long time, if you want, without encountering or needing anything from a religious institution. Okay. So, he says there's also secularization happening at what he calls the meso level. And sometimes I spell it wrong, there's two different spellings of meso. You can spell it with a Z, or you can spell it with an S. He spells it with an S because he's American, but I think the proper British spelling would have a Z. Okay, so secularization happens within religious institutions, which he calls internal secularization. So you can think of this, right? Secularization of institutions of higher learning, right, that have denominal affiliation. So if we look at some of the, you can do this for Canada too, but if we look at some of the great kind of American universities, right, you have Harvard, which was founded by Calvinists, so the Reformed Church. Yale, which was founded by Congregationalists. Princeton by Presbyterians. Duke by Methodists. And Notre Dame by Catholics. Generally speaking, things like hiring decisions, curriculum decisions in these places are not ultimately made on religious grounds. They're made on secular grounds. And most of the time, right, hospitals that still have or had religious kind of foundings operate using management procedures and administrative processes that are kind of broadly accepted, right? And here, both in Canada and the US, Catholic hospitals, right, like the Grey Nuns, the Misericordia, have to walk a careful tightrope between kind of social values and religious beliefs, right? So like, Covenant Health, which operates Catholic hospitals in Alberta, limits things like abortion, sterilization, and medical assistance in dying or euthanasia at their hospitals, but they have to walk a really careful line on these things so as not to transgress social values too much. Okay, do I have time? I'll give you one other example. And here I'm going to give you an example of what this looks like at University of Notre Dame, right? So it's in Illinois. No, Indiana. I always get those two mixed up. In Indiana, right? So a very famous Catholic university. And probably about 6 years ago, there was a student petition circulated by a Catholic group on campus that basically asked the university to block pornography on the university's internet and wireless systems, right? And they petitioned the board of the University of Notre Dame in order to get pornography blocked from the kind of Wi-Fi and internet systems at Notre Dame. And this went all the way up to the board of the university's board and the president, who, by the way, is a Catholic priest. And can you guess what the board said? They said no, right? They refused to engage in censorship in a way that would potentially violate the First Amendment in the United States. So what did they do? They made a decision on something that religion, right, Catholicism, has very, very strong views on pornography in such a way as was very secular at the end of the day. Okay, so that's meso-level secularization, right? Religious institutions start to make decisions in less religious ways. And we'll talk about micro-level, and we'll finish up secularization on Friday. All right. Have a good one. All righty.